Newt. Wait.
Hello, Catherine.
Hello, Newt.
I love you.
I know.
Too late?
Too late. Are you all right?
Yes. It's a fine walk.
I thought so.
Part ways here.
Where will you go?
Get you right into town. Turn myself in.
Good luck.
You too. Marry me, Catherine.
No.
Catherine.
Indeed a shame that Papa was. It's indeed a shame that Papa was full. 6 weeks and still my grief is such that it feels as though your father passed away only yesterday. And now, adding insult to injury, being forced to live as my daughter-in-law's guest in my own home. It is indeed a shame that Papa was forced to leave the estate to John. Perhaps some allowance for us was... John! We were unaware of your arrival. I trust you've been made comfortable.
Certainly, ma'am. Eleanor, Marianne, you remember Fanny.
Mrs. Dashwood, Miss Dashwood, Miss Marianne.
How do you do, Mrs. Dashwood?
Well, thank you. My brother should be arriving shortly. He insisted on stopping by the booksellers on the way here, and will be arriving by separate coach.
Your brother?
Yes, Mr. Edward Ferrars. Perhaps I failed to mention he would be staying with us for some time.
Dear John, Fanny, if there's anything we can do to ensure your comfort, please do not hesitate to ask. And please be advised that we mean to quit Norland as soon as possible in order to avoid being of any further inconvenience.
It is no inconvenience, I assure you.
Even so, I have sent out inquiries about new lodgings, and as soon as we find one that our modest income can afford, we shall move at once.
On his deathbed, my father asked that you be provided for. It will be my pleasure to present you with £2,200.
Ah, may I present my brother Edward Ferrars? Edward, this is Mrs. Dashwood, Miss Eleanor Dashwood, and Miss Marianne Dashwood.
Miss Dashwood. Miss Marianne, how do you do?
How do you do?
I brought. That is, I thought. The truth is, we are imparting a monstrous inconvenience on the three of you, and at a time when your heart's still sure to be in the deepest mourning. These are but trifles, my gratitude to your hospitality, a terribly insignificant token to acknowledge grief, but I thought perhaps...
This is terribly kind of you, Mr. Ferris. Completely unnecessary, but greatly appreciated.
Well, I took a chance in guessing what might appeal to each of you. Only hope my choice is made. Please, if only in the slightest, for Miss Dashwood.
The three tragedies of William Shakespeare. Oh, Mr. Ferris, I dare say these are three of my favorite plays. Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and, oh, Titus and Andronicus. This was most kind of you.
For Miss Dashwood.
The poetry of Lord Byron, my favorite poet by far, Mr. Ferris. I'm quite overcome by your uncanny insight.
And for Miss Marianne.
The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. Oh, thank you kindly, Mr. Ferris.
You are not pleased.
Oh, no, I'm quite pleased.
I can tell by expression you are not. I fear I took the bookseller's advice for this one. He assured me that Gothic romances were all the rage to young women these days. You may be honest with me, Miss Marianne. My feelings shall not be wounded.
I suppose for most young women they are. It is just that...
Pray, go on.
It is simply this. Will the future of womanhood ever recover from the Gothic romance?
I'm afraid I don't understand you.
Of what women suffer at the hands of the likes of Horace Walpole, Anne Radcliffe, oh, God forbid, Monk Lewis! These simpering, whining ninnies that the authors have the gall to name heroines, who faint at the very hint of blood, the glimpse of danger, the whisper of a dark intent, all waiting helplessly, powerlessly for the gallant hero to come and rescue them. Well, do you not agree, Mr. Ferris?
I'm afraid I lack the insight to honestly answer that question, Miss Marianne. I've never actually read a Gothic and... Oh, nor have I even heard of such a thing before I entered the booksellers today.
But surely you have an appreciation for the picturesque.
I like fine prospect, but not picturesque principles. Do like crooked, twisted, blasted trees.
Mr. Ferris, would you do us the honor of reading from Lord Byron?
Certainly. I'd be delighted. She walks in beauty, like the night, of cloudless climes, starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright. Me in her aspect and her eyes, was mellowed to that tender light, which heaven to gaudy day denies.
Nothing. Nothing at all. It's either an uninhabitable shack or it's a manor we could never afford in our wildest dreams.
Well, we mustn't. What's this? Dear Mrs. Dashwood, I understand you are in great need of new and modest accommodations. I hereby offer to you my small and charming house, the rent of which I shall extend to you on very easy terms. Though this furnished house is merely a cottage, I assure you that should this situation please you, everything shall be done to improve it that you may find necessary. The cottage is in Barton, near Devonshire. I pray you find these accommodations to your liking, and I patiently await your response. Sincerely, your cousin, Sir John Middleton.
Mamma, 'tis the perfect solution.
It is indeed. I shall accept his invitation immediately. My only regret would be separating Eleanor from Edward at such a volatile time in their relationship. But I'm sure that separation will not last for long. In a few months, my dear Marianne, Eleanor may in all probability be settled for life. My dear Fanny, I have wonderful news to impart. And now that John and Eleanor are present, they may hear it as well. We have found accommodations and shall be leaving Norland immediately.
Have you indeed?
My cousin Sir John Middleton has a house in Devonshire, which he has graciously offered to rent to us.
In Devonshire? And to what part of it?
Barton, within 4 miles northward of Exeter. It is but a cottage, but I hope to see many of my friends in it. And Edward will naturally be invited to visit as often as possible.
I doubt Edward will have much time for visiting. I'm sure he'll be married soon with a house of his own to settle. My mother has very high hopes for Edward and our younger brother Robert. She wishes to see Edward in particular as a fine figure in the world. In Parliament, perhaps. Naturally, his fortune depends on his marrying well. My mother is quite resolved on that point. And any low-born woman without any real prospects would threaten his inheritance.
Well, suppose I could start loading the furniture on the cart.
All your belongings packed?
Yes, Mamma. As you advised, we packed weeks ago in anticipation for our departure.
Then I suppose I must dismiss the servants, as Fanny wants nothing to do with them. Thomas, of course, will be coming with us, but we can afford no more than one servant. Oh, how happy I shall be to be out of that woman's company!
Oh, I shall miss this place. Each nook and cranny holds in it some sense of sentimentality, some nostalgic remembrance of times long gone. 'Tis a shame we cannot make our travels as snails do, bearing our house upon our backs. If we are to be leaving so soon, and by all indications we are, I should finish drawing my picture of the garden, so you might remember it always.
What a pity it is, Eleanor, that Edward should have no taste for drawing.
No taste for drawing? Why should you think so? He does not draw himself, indeed, but he does enjoy the performances of other people, and I assure you he's by no means deficient in natural taste, though he has not had many opportunities of improving them.
Do not be offended, Eleanor, if my praise of him is not in everything equal to your sense of his merits. I have not had so many opportunities of estimating the more minute propensities of his minds and inclinations and tastes as you have, but I think the world of his goodness and character. I think him everything in the world that is good and amiable.
I am sure his dearest friends cannot be dissatisfied with such commendation as that. I do not see how you could have perceived yourself more warmly.
When you tell me to love him as a brother, I shall no longer see imperfection in his taste than I now do in his heart.
I do not attempt to deny that I think very highly of him, that I greatly esteem him, that I like him.
Esteem him? Like him? Oh, cold-hearted, Eleanor, or worse than cold-hearted. Use those words again and I will leave the room this instant.
Be assured that I mean no offense to you by speaking in so quiet a way of my own feelings. I am, however, unsure of his regard for me. There are moments when the extent of it seems doubtful, and until his sentiments are fully known, you cannot wonder at my wishing to avoid any encouragement of my own partiality by believing or calling him more than it is.
Then you are not engaged to him.
Indeed not.
Yet it certainly soon will happen. But two advantages will proceed from this delay. I shall not lose you so soon, and Edward will have greater opportunity for improving that natural taste that must be so indispensably necessary for your future felicity. Oh, if he should be so far inspired by your genius as to learn to draw himself, how delightful it would be. Now, before you retire to the garden, will you not indulge my fancy of reading Shakespeare with me as we did as children one last time in the drawing room?
My dear Marianne, I can deny you nothing.
Oh, which shall we read from? Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, or Titus Andronicus?
You choose, Marianne.
Let us read from Romeo and Juliet. Oh, Capulet's masquerade where they first meet, my favorite scene.
And should you read Romeo's part as usual?
Of course, Eleanor, Shakespeare was little better than Anne Radcliffe in regard to women. Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night as a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. So shows a snowy dove trooping among crows, as yonder lady or her fellow shows the measure done. And
Oh dear, what's another coxswain?
nonsense, Edward. I was only just lamenting my ill fortune at having to always read the male parts to satisfy Eleanor's passion for reading from Shakespeare. How fortuitous that you should have arrived to relieve me of my duty. Here is where we left off, Edward, at the measure done. Thank you for your gallant and timely rescue.
Yes. Yes. The measure done, I watch her place stand, and touching hers, make blessed my rude hand. Did my heart love to now for swear's sake, for I ne'er saw true beauty till this night. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this. My lips, two blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth the rough touch with a tender kiss.
Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which manly devotion shows in this, for saints have hands which pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm, holy palmers kiss.
Have not saints' lips and holy palms too?
I pilgrim and saints' lips they must use in prayer.
But then, dear saint, the lips do it hands too.
Edward!
Miss Stashwood, Eleanor, there's a matter of gravest importance I must speak to you before you leave Nolan. You see, a few years ago I was studying under care of Mr. Pratt in Longstaple, near Plymouth.
Edward! John is just assisted loading the Dashwood furniture.
In a moment, dear Fanny. Where was I?
Plymouth, Mr. Pratt.
Indeed, yes. Well, during my stay with Mr. Pratt, something rather extraordinary happened. I met...
Edward, will you kindly assist your brother-in-law in carrying some of the larger furniture, or would you have him throw his back out again?
Perhaps we may finish this discussion another time.
To be sure, you're invited to visit us at Barton Cottage as often as you please.
I thank you, Miss Dashwood.
Good afternoon, ladies. This is a gentleman I promised to introduce you to. Colonel Brandon, this is Miss Dashwood and her daughter, Miss Marianne.
How do you do?
It's a pleasure to meet you, Colonel Brandon.
The pleasure is all mine, I assure you.
Well, shall we sit down to tea?
Miss Marianne, as I was taking my evening stroll yesterday, I passed by this very cottage and heard to my astonishment the most beautiful singing I believe I've ever heard before in my life. When I inquired this morning as to whom this voice belonged, Mrs. Jennings informed me that it was you, Miss Marianne. May I offer my compliments, Miss Marianne?
Thank you, Colonel Brandon.
Have you enjoyed your stay thus far in Barton, Mrs. Dashwood?
Oh, it is perfectly charming. We are much obliged to Mrs. Jennings and her son-in-law, Sir John, for the renting of it.
Well, it was certainly no trouble for us.
Barton Park is especially delightful. I can scarce keep Marianne away.
But I hope neither of you have left your hearts behind in Sussex.
To be sure, I have not.
Ah, Miss Eleanor, who's the lucky man?
Remember that whatever your conjectures may be, you have no right to repeat them.
I have no conjectures about it. It was you who told me of it yourself.
Oh, pray, Miss Marianne, let us know all about it. What is his name?
Evidently, I may not say.
At least his initials.
Marianne, you know that this is all an invention of your own, and there was no such person in existence.
Well, then he must be lately dead, Eleanor, for I am sure there was a man once. And his name begins with an F.
I dare say I hear the rain starting up again.
I believe you are correct, Mrs. Dashwood, as evidenced by sudden pangs of my rheumatism in my shoulder.
Oh.
It has been raining ever frequently as of late, nearly enough to warrant flannel waistcoats. In fact, I should be taking my leave before it begins to pour.
But Colonel Brandon, you have only just arrived. The Dashwoods are most certainly in want of entertainment.
Begging your pardon, Mrs. Jennings, but I'm afraid I must. Ladies,
Goodbye, Colonel Brandon. It was lovely meeting you.
thank you, Miss Dashwood. Likewise, I'm sure.
I do declare that Colonel Brandon is already in love with Miss Marianne, and what an excellent match, for he is rich, and Miss Marianne is handsome. Oh, I've been anxious to see Colonel Brandon married ever since John brought it to my attention. That is, of course, I'm anxious to get a good husband for every pretty girl. Oh, I think there is with my teasing. I shall leave you my presents for now, but I shall be back soon to hear more about the mysterious Mr. F.
Colonel Brandon does seem a nice gentleman indeed. You would do very well, Marianne, to...
Mama, he is ancient.
I just might take offense to that, Marianne. He is not much younger than myself and not nearly as old as Mrs. Jennings.
But certainly you cannot deny the absurdity of the accusation, though you may not think it intentionally ill-natured. Colonel Brandon is certainly younger than Mrs. Jennings, but he is old enough to be my father. And if he was ever animated enough to be in love, he must have long outlived every sensation of the kind. It is too ridiculous. When is a man to be safe from such wit if age and infirmity will not protect him?
Infirmity? Do you call Colonel Brandon infirm? I can easily suppose that his age may appear greater to you than to our mother, but you can hardly deceive yourself as to his having the use of his limbs.
Did you not hear him complain of rheumatism? And is that not the most common infirmity of declining life?
My dear child, at this rate you must be in continual terror of my decay. And it must seem a miracle to you that my life has been extended to the advanced age of 45.
I must object to your dooming Colonel Brandon to the constant confinement of a sick chamber, merely because he chanced to complain on a very cold, damp day of a slight rheumatism in one of his shoulders.
But he talked of flannel waistcoats! And with me, a flannel waistcoat is invariably connected with aches, cramps, rheumatisms, and every species of ailment that can afflict the old and feeble.
Had he been in a violent fever, you'd not have despised him half so much. Confess, Marianne, it's not something interesting to you in the quick pulse of a fever.
Well, I'm not going to remain indoors and restless, waiting for adventure to come to me. I'm going to go find adventure.
Marianne, you're not going to the park again today, are you? The rain has increased and you'll catch your death out there. At the very least, tomorrow morning you'll be complaining of rheumatism and requesting a flannel cloak.
You know perfectly well, Eleanor, that I am in perfect health. And I shan't stay out long besides.
I wish he'd been more fond of Colonel Brandon and his reserve.
Sir John had hinted previously that Colonel Brandon has suffered many injuries and disappointments, but Marianne, who is prejudiced against him for being neither lively nor young, seems resolved to undervalue his merits.
In truth, Eleanor, Mrs. Jennings has revealed to me in confidence the entire story behind Colonel Brandon's suffering. He has a rather dark past indeed. Well, don't you want to hear it?
Mamma, if Mrs. Jennings told you in confidence, perhaps be prudent.
He was wildly in love in his youth. A young orphaned girl, a close relation of his named Eliza, was raised with him in his father's household. When they were both 17, she was, against her inclination, to marry the Colonel's brother. She and the Colonel contrived to elope together to Scotland, but within hours of their escape, the maid betrayed them, and Eliza was lost to him forever. Broken-hearted, the colonel joined the regiment in the East Indies, little knowing that his brother treated Eliza unkindly and did not love her. 2 years later, Colonel Brandon heard of the divorce. It was another 3 years before he could return to England to find her, and when he did, she had been reduced to a life of sin.
Mrs. Jennings has done the Colonel most unkindly by revealing this part of his past, which I am sure he meant to keep secret, and you are doing him a greater injustice by sharing it with me.
But, Eleanor, you've not heard the best part. After 6 months of searching for her, he finally found her, living in a sponging house of all things. Mrs. Jennings is not sure how much time had passed before she became ill, but within weeks of his arrival, she died of consumption. He stayed by her side until the very end, and just before she died, she gave
Please forgive my abrupt intrusion. I was hunting on the hillside between here and the park when I heard a cry of distress. Upon investigating, I found this young lady lying in the grass, her ankle twisted in a fall. I took the liberty of ascertaining that the ankle was merely twisted and not broken, and after carefully... Excuse me, something's come over me. And after carefully inquiring after a place of residence, I carried her here, lest she catch cold and wait for help to arrive or injure the ankle further by walking on it.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
I only hope you forgive my rash intrusion. I must admit, I'd always wanted to see the inside of this cottage. I've been so charmed by the outside, but I'd imagine the circumstances allowed me to do so, being rather more polite.
There is nothing to forgive, but profound gratitude to bestow upon you for the safe return of my daughter.
Most obliged to you, ma'am.
Will you not be seated?
Oh, I thank you, but I must decline. Being wet and dirty as I am, I would be devastated if I soiled your furniture.
At least tell us to whom we are so obliged.
My name is John Willoughby, ma'am. My present home is at Allenham, from whence I hope you might allow me the honor of calling tomorrow to inquire after this young lady.
Oh, yes!
Then I shall take my leave and look forward to meet you all properly tomorrow. Ah, The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. One of my favorites, I'm rather ashamed to admit.
Oh, it is also one of my favorites.
And who is reading Lord Byron?
I am. That is, we all are.
I'm rather more partial to Blake myself.
Oh, so am I.
I have an autographed copy of The Marriage Between Heaven and Hell. Perhaps you'd like to see it?
I would love to.
Then I shall bring it with me. Until tomorrow, ladies.
Good day, Mr. Willoughby.
Oh, Marianne, you've done very well. I dare say you could not have chosen a more opportune moment to fall and twist your ankle.
He was most gallant, was he not? And so well spoken.
He was a perfect gentleman.
His person and air equal to what my fancy has ever drawn for the hero of a favorite story.
Much like one of those Gothic romances you are suddenly so exceedingly fond of.
Oh.
Everything about him suggested excellence. His name is good, his residence is in our favorite village, and he carried himself with the utmost style and elegance. Oh, tomorrow, 'tis 20 years till then.
Well, Marianne, for 1 week I'd saved him pretty well. You've already asserted Mr. Willoughby's opinion in almost every matter of importance. You know what he thinks of Cooper and Scott. You've received every assurance of his marrying Pope, noble and as proper. But how is your engagement meant to be long supported under such extraordinary dispatch for every subject of discourse? You will soon have exhausted each favorite topic. Another meeting will suffice in hearing what he thinks of picturesque beauty and second marriages, but then you'll have nothing further to ask.
I see. I have been open and sincere where I ought to have been reserved, spiritless, dull, and deceitful. Had I only spoken once in 10 minutes, and had I only talked of the weather and the roads, this reproach would have been spared.
You must not be offended with Eleanor, Marianne. She was only in jest. I should scold her myself if she were capable of wishing to check the delight of our conversation with our new friend.
I see nothing to censor in him, but a propensity of saying too much of what he thinks without attention to person or circumstance. He displays a want of caution, which I cannot approve of in spite of all that Marianne can say in its support.
How do you do, Mr. Willoughby?
I'm afraid I am suffering under very heavy disappointment. I am unable to keep my engagements with you, as Miss Smith has this morning exercised the privilege of riches upon a poor dependent cousin by sending me on business in London. I have just received my dispatches and taken my farewell of Allenham, and I have now come to take my farewell of you.
To London, and are you going today?
Almost this moment.
Well, surely you cannot
I'm afraid
move.
I must.
This is very unfortunate, but Mrs. Smith must be obliged, and I'm sure her business will not detain you from us for long.
You are very kind, but I have no idea of returning to Devonshire immediately. My visits to Miss Smith are never repeated within the 12 months.
And is Mrs. Smith your only friend? Is Allenham the only house in the neighborhood to which you will be welcome? For shame, Willoughby! Will you not wait for an invitation here?
You are too good, but my engagements at present are of such a nature that I dare not flatter myself. It is folly to linger in this manner. I will not torment myself any longer by remaining among friends whose society is impossible for me now to enjoy.
This is all very strange. What could have happened?
I have thought it all over, I assure you. And I can perfectly account for everything that at first seemed strange to me as well as to you.
Can you indeed?
Yes. I am persuaded that Mrs. Smith suspects his regard for Marianne, disapproves of it, and on that account is eager to get him away. And that the business in which she sends him off to transact is invented as an excuse to dismiss him.
Perhaps it may be proper to conceal their engagement from Mrs. Smith, if they are engaged, and if that is true, then it would be expedient for Willoughby to be as little in Devonshire as possible as present. But that is no excuse for their concealing it from us.
Concealing it from us? My dear child, do you accuse Marianne Willoughby of concealment? This is very strange indeed, when your eyes have been reproaching them every day for incautiousness.
I need no proof of their affection, but of their engagement I do.
I am perfectly satisfied of both.
I confess that every circumstance, except one, has pointed to their engagement, but that one is the total silence of both on the subject. Now, we are doing Marianne no good by quarreling amongst ourselves. I will see if she will speak to me.
Pray do, Eleanor.
I do wish you would accompany us today. You've missed most of London's greatest sights. You cannot waste away your room forever, Marianne. Life is passing you by. Today we're visiting Westminster Abbey.
I have no stomach for London society. There's but one face I would like to see, and until I hear from him, I have no desire to wander about in the soot of London's coal factories.
Marianne, it has been 4 months.
For me,
Yes, ma'am.
my dear madam, I have just had the honor of receiving your letter, which I beg to return, with my sincere acknowledgements. I shall never reflect on my former acquaintance with your family in Devonshire without the most grateful pleasure, and flatter myself it will not be broken by any mistake or misapprehension of my actions. My esteem for your whole family is very sincere, but if I have been so unfortunate as to give rise to a belief or more that I felt or meant to express, I shall reproach myself for not having been more guarded in my professions of that esteem. That I should have ever meant more you allowed to be impossible when you understand that my affections have long been engaged elsewhere, and it will not be many weeks, I believe, before this engagement is fulfilled. It is with great regret that I return the letters with which I have been honoured from you and the lock of hair which you obligingly bestowed upon me. I am, dear madam, your most obedient, humble servant, John Willoughby.
Exert yourself, dear Marianne. If you would not kill yourself and all who love you, think of your mother. Think of her misery while you suffer. For her sake, you must exert yourself.
I cannot. Leave me if I distress you. Leave me, hate me, forget me, but do not torment me so. Oh, how easy it is for those who have no sorrow of their own to talk of exertion. Happy Eleanor, you have not an idea of what I suffer.
Do you call me happy, Marianne? Oh, if you knew, and how could you think me to be so when I see you so wretched?
Forgive me. I know you feel for me. I know what a heart you have, but you must be happy. Edward loves you. What can do away such happiness as that?
Many circumstances.
No. He loves you and only you. You can know no grief.
I can know no pleasure while I see you in this state.
And you'll never see me otherwise. Mine is a misery which nothing can do away.
You must not talk so, Marianne. Much as you suffer now, think of what you would have suffered if the discovery of his character had been delayed to a later period. If your engagement had gone on for months and months, as it might have been, before you decided to put an end to it. Every day of unhappy confidence on your side would have made the blow more dreadful.
Engagement? There's been no engagement.
No engagement?
No, he is not so unworthy as you believe him to be. He has broken no faith with me.
Yet he told you he loved you?
Yes! No! Never absolutely. It was every day implied, but never professedly declared. Sometimes I thought it had been, but it never was.
And you wrote to him?
Yes. Could that be so wrong after all that had happened? I felt myself to be as solemnly engaged to him as if the strictest legal covenant had bound us to each other.
I can believe it, but unfortunately he did not feel the
But he
same.
did feel the same, Eleanor. I know he did. For weeks and weeks he felt it. Whatever may have changed him now, I was once as dear to him as my own soul could wish. I want to go home, Eleanor. Cannot we be gone tomorrow?
Tomorrow? Marianne?
Yes, I only came here for Willoughby's sake, and now who cares for me? Who regards me?
It would be impossible to go tomorrow. We owe Mrs. Jennings much more than civility, and civility of the commonest kind would prevent such a hasty removal as that.
Then another day or two, perhaps, but I cannot stay here long. I cannot stay to endure the questions and remarks of these people. How am I to bear their pity?
How do you do, my dear? How is she, Miss Dashwood? Poor thing, she looks very bad. No wonder. Aye, it is too true. I just heard from a friend of Miss Grey herself. He is to be married soon, the good-for-nothing fellow. He is a young lady of my acquaintance, abominably but ill, and I wish with all my soul his wife may plague his heart out. Well, when there's plenty of money on one side, next nothing on the other, Lord bless you, they care no more about such things.
The lady, then, Miss Grey, I think you called her, is very rich.
£50,000, my dear. Well, my dear, 'tis a true saying about an ill wind, for it will all be better for Colonel Brandon. It will all the one be a better match for your sister, £2,000 a year, without debt or drawback, except the little love child. I'd forgotten her. Well, I shall split up the Colonel as soon as I can. One shoulder mutton, you know, drives the other down. If only we can put Willoughby out of her mind.
Aye, if we can do that, we should do very well with or without Colonel Brandon.
Ah, Miss Dashwood. May I express my pleasure at finding you here in London. Is Miss Marianne...
Marianne is not well. She's been indisposed all day, and we persuaded her to go to bed.
Perhaps what I heard then just now there may be more truth in it than I could believe possible at first.
You mean Mr. Willoughby's engagement to Miss Grey?
Yes, my regard for your sister, for yourself, for your mother. Will you allow me to prove it by relating some circumstances regarding Mr. Willoughby?
Pray, let me hear it.
You will find me a very awkward narrator, Miss Dashwood. I hardly know where to begin. Perhaps you have heard something from Mrs. Jennings of my ill-fated connection with a young lady named Eliza?
Yes.
I gathered as much. Yet her indiscretion will save me time explaining. When I found Eliza after my return to England, she was in the last stages of consumption. She left in my care her only child, the offspring of her first guilty connection, who at the time was just 3 years old. Mrs. Jennings is convinced that the child, Elizabeth, is my natural daughter and will not be persuaded otherwise. Yet it is no matter, for I have cared for her as though she were my own, and could not have suffered more on her account if she had been mine. As I had no family and no home, little Elizabeth was placed under the care of a respectable woman in Dorsetshire. But last February, when she was 16, I had allowed her at her earnest desire to go to Bath with one of her young friends, and she suddenly disappeared. I could learn nothing but that she was gone. All the rest, for 8 long months, was left to conjecture. What I thought, what I feared, may be imagined, and what I suffered too.
You mean she...
She was with child.
Good heavens. Could Willoughby?
Yes, I'm afraid it is true. The young woman whose youth and innocence he had seduced in a situation of the utmost distress, he left with no creditable home, no help, no friends, ignorant of his address. He had left her promising to return, but he neither returned nor wrote nor relieved her.
This is beyond everything.
His character is now before you, expensive, dissipated, and worse than both. And knowing all this as I have now known it many weeks, imagine what I must have felt on seeing your sister as fond of him as ever, and on being assured that she was to be married. Guess what I must have felt for all your sakes. But use your own discretion, however, in communicating to her what I have told you.
I have been more pained by her meaning to acquit him than by all else, for it irritates her mind more than the most perfect conviction of his unworthiness could do. Now, though at first she will suffer much, I am sure she will soon become easier. Is Elizabeth still in town?
No. When she recovered from her lying in, for I found her near her delivery, I removed her and her child to the country, and there they remain. Now, I'm sure my long account has divided you from your sister long enough. I shall take up no more of your time.
I thank you for your trust in revealing this part of your past, which I'm sure was very difficult. And for Marianne's sake, I thank you for your compassion as well.
May it help your sister, as her happiness is my greatest wish.
And so she is now living in the countryside with a child-to-be, under the constant care of Colonel Brandon as often as humanly possible, I am sure. Oh, Marianne, was I right to tell you?
Yes, it has lifted some of the weight from my heart, though my misery is still great.
I am glad, since I must also tell you, Willoughby is now married.
Lord, my dears, have you heard the news?
No, ma'am, what is it?
Mr. Edward Ferrars, it seems, has been engaged above this 12-month to Lucy Steele. Could you ever believe such a thing possible? This was kept a secret for fear of Mrs. Ferrars, and what she suffered when your sister-in-law first broke the news is not to be described. While she, with the truest affection, had been planning a most eligible connection for Edward, could it ever been supposed that he had been engaged to another person? All that Mrs. Ferrars could say to Edward to make him put an end to the engagement was of no avail, for he said nothing should prevail upon him to give up the engagement. He should stand to it, cost him what it might.
Gracious God, can this be possible?
But if he had done otherwise, I should have thought him a rascal. He's proven himself an honest man.
How did it end?
Edward is forever dismissed from his mother's notice, and his mother determined to settle that estate upon her younger son Robert, which might have been Edward's on proper conditions. Can anything be more galling to the spirit of a man than to see his younger brother in possession of an estate which might have been his own? Poor Edward, I feel for him sincerely.
What are his plans now?
He should go to Oxford to study and take up his orders, I am told. Now, if you'll excuse me, my dears, there are plenty to whom I must tell all, despite this dreadful weather.
How long has this been known to you, Eleanor? Has he written to you?
4 months ago, when Lucy Steele called us at Barton Cottage, she told me in confidence of her engagement.
4 months? So calm, so cheerful. Are you so unfeeling?
For 4 months, Marianne, I have had all of this weighing on me without being at liberty to speak of it to a single creature, knowing that it would make you and my mother most unhappy, yet unable to prepare you for it in the least. I have known myself to be divided from Edward forever, without hearing one circumstance that can make me less desire the connection. And all of this is going on at a time when, as you too well know, it is not for my only unhappiness. If you can think of me capable of ever feeling, surely you may see that I have suffered now. Had I not been bound to silence, perhaps nothing could have kept me entirely. Not even what I owed to my dearest friends from showing that I was very unhappy.
Oh, Eleanor, you have made me hate myself forever. How barbarous have I been to you? You who have been my only comfort, who seem to be only suffering for me. Is this my gratitude? Is this the only return I can make to you?
You must promise to never tell Edward, and to show him your usual politeness and kindness. I would not want him to be distressed upon not hearing your warmth.
I promise, Eleanor. I must walk now. There's so much to think of, so much pain to consider.
Marianne, you absolutely cannot go out now. You have not been well as it is, and the rain.
I have not been out in weeks, Eleanor. I cannot abide staying indoors a moment longer. I must have fresh air.
And do not be gone long.
I shan't.
Oh, dear heavens, what's happened?
I found her this way in the park.
A blanket, please, Mr. Jennings.
The poor dear is as cold as death.
It is all my fault. I should never let her go out. She has not been well.
I'll fetch a doctor.
May I stay until she is out of danger?
Yes, Colonel Brandon, thank you so much for finding her.
Perhaps I should prepare some hot soup for when she awakens.
Please. Oh, Marianne. Marianne, please.
The 20th year is well nigh past, since first our sky was overcast. Ah, would that this might be the last. My Mary, thy spirits have a fainter flow, I see thee daily weaker grow. 'Twas my distress that brought thee low. My Mary. Ah, the doctors insisted we change the sheets. I hope you do not object to my bringing her here while Thomas is changing the linens and freshening the room.
Of course not.
Is there something I may do to assist? I am going mad with this helplessness.
As am I, Colonel, but you've done so much already. Surely she is somewhat comforted by your reading from her favorite authors in constant presence, but you've hardly slept for days.
If my diligence has earned but one degree of respite for her, then it is well worth my unnoticed and insignificant discomfort.
Colonel Brandon, the doctor has stated numerous times that her fever may be contagious. Perhaps it would be in your best interest to...
Your concern is appreciated, but I shall remain here until she either has employment for me or has recovered completely.
There is one thing.
You need only hint at a wish for her sake, and I would gladly give my life to grant it.
Perhaps some others should be sent for.
I shall write to Barton immediately.
The bedchamber is ready for Miss Marianne. Shall I?
Thank you, Thomas. I'll bring her in.
At last we are alone, my Eleanor. And now that Marianne is out of danger, I can tell you with all my happiness, Colonel Brandon loves Marianne. He told me so himself. He opened his whole heart to me yesterday as we traveled. It came out quite unawares, quite undesignedly. He has loved her, my Eleanor, since the first moment of seeing her.
I highly value and esteem him, and if Marianne can be happy with him, I think the connection the greatest blessing in the world. What did you say to him? Did you allow him to hope?
Oh, my love, I cannot then talk of hope to him or to myself. Marianne might at that moment be dying. But he did not ask for hope. Time, a very little time, I told him, will do everything. Marianne's heart is not to be wasted on the likes of Willoughby. His own merits must soon secure it.
Cats also feel, as well as we, that passion's force, and so did she. Her climbing she began to find exposed her too much to the wind, and the old utensil of tin was cold and comfortless within. She therefore wished, instead of those, some place of more serene repose, where neither cold might come nor air, too rudely wanton with her hair, and sought it in the likeliest mode within her master's snug abode.
Marianne, you're looking splendid. Indeed, nearly all the colour has returned to your cheeks.
I am much recovered. My illness, I know now, was entirely brought on by myself, by such negligence of my own health, as I deemed it even the time to be wrong. And, Eleanor, had I died, in what peculiar misery should I have left you in? My nurse, my friend, my sister.
Marianne, you must not reprove yourself. Time will heal all wounds, but for your frankness and contrition, I offer all the support and praise I am capable of.
You are very good. The future will be my proof. But tell me, in what state is your heart these days?
Healing a little each day, just as yours does, but I must say I am growing impatient with tidings of Edward. We must not make inquiries on such prohibited a subject, but we must assume he is still in Oxford.
Have you not heard, ma'am, that Mr. Ferris is married?
Who told you that Mr. Ferris is married, Thomas?
I saw Miss Lucy Steele this morning. She inquired after you and Miss Marianne and told me to send her regards along with her husband, Mr. Fez. She said how sorry she was that they had not had time to come on and see you, but they'd make sure and come and see you soon.
Did Mrs. Ferris look well?
Yes, ma'am. She told me how very well she was, and in my mind, she'd always been a very handsome young lady. Oh, there's Mr. Ferris himself coming to the door. Shall I show him in?
Yes, of course. He's come explicitly from practice to see us. I will be calm and will be mistress of myself.
I wish you great joy, Edward.
Well, I thank you, Miss Dashwood.
Will you not be seated?
Yes, certainly. Colonel Brandon, Miss Marianne, Miss Dashwood.
Ahem! I hope you've left Mrs. Ferris well.
Yes, Miss Ferris quite well.
Is Mrs. Ferris in Longstaple?
At Longstaple? No, my mother's in town.
I meant to inquire after Mrs. Edward Ferris.
Perhaps you mean Mrs. Robert Ferris.
Mrs. Robert Ferris?
Perhaps you do not know. You may not have heard that my brother's lately married to Miss Lucy Steele. They were married last week and are now at Dawlish.
Then you're not married?
No. Oh dear, what another coxswain might been. Mrs. Dashwood, my engagement was a foolish, idle inclination on the side, consequence of ignorance of the world and want of employment. I thought it my duty, independent of my feelings, to give Lucy the option of continuing the engagement. When not, when I was renounced by my mother and stood all appearance in the world without a friend to assist me. She had spent some time in Nolan, in my brother's company, and formed an attachment. Schooling in high school and learning, he was to hear it all from my mother. In short, with an hour receiving Lucy's letter, I quitted Oxford, with only one object before me, the nearest road to where you were. My errand, in fact, is a simple one. It's only to ask you to marry me. Eleanor, there's only one woman in my heart, now and forever. Will you marry me?
Of course.
You have my consent.
That is fine, Mrs. Jennings. Will you not come, Colonel?
Marianne, I have something particular I would like to ask you. All the romance and excitement, I fear, has emboldened me to ask the question I have been long meaning to ask, though I know your answer. Yet a foolish, romantic whim of my heart urges me to ask it anyway. I know you cannot love me, Marianne, but I can offer you all my dedication, my sincerest devotion, and promise you lifelong security. Will you... No, of course not. I shouldn't have. This will only cause you pain.
Colonel, I was born to an extraordinary fate. I was born to discover the falsehood of my own opinions and to reevaluate my favorite maxims. I was born to overcome the strong affection and to voluntarily give my heart to another. To a man who has suffered no less than I under the event of a former attachment, and whom, a year ago, I had considered too old to be married, and who still seeks the constitutional safeguard of a flannel waistcoat.
Marianne, am I to understand you correctly? Are you saying yes to my proposal?
Yes, Colonel, I am. And know this, I could never love by halves. My whole heart and time will be entirely devoted to you.
Oh, Marianne. Shall we tell Mrs. Jennings?
We want the whole world to know, do we not?
Hey guys, can we give it up one more time for this huge cast and crew that has done such a great job? And I just wanted to recognize, I don't know if she's still up here, Miss Emily Garner, real quick. She can step forward. I don't know where she went. Oh, good. She's over here. For these amazing costumes, y'all. Completely incredible. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. We so appreciate it.